The success of the Nightfall changed everything because within 6 months a fleet of shadow ships slipped through the dimensional barrier carrying colonists and equipment and the dreams of a species that refused to accept imprisonment, and each vessel moved through space like ghosts invisible to the sensors that the Galactic Coalition used to monitor the universe. Commander Kelly Price stood on the bridge of the Dark Wind watching construction drones assemble the first human colony beyond the barrier, on a moon circling a massive gas giant, in a system the Coalition had marked as too remote to bother with. And the sight filled her with both pride and unease because they were building an entire civilization based on hiding. Lieutenant Chris Morgan served as her first officer, and he watched the colony take shape with satisfaction, and he said they were ghosts now moving through the galaxy, without anyone knowing they existed, and his voice carried confidence that Kelly wished she could share. Kelly turned from the viewport and told Chris that building everything on deception troubled her, because eventually the truth would come out, and when it did, the consequences could be catastrophic. But Chris insisted the Coalition would never find them because humanity's stealth technology was generations ahead of anything in the Coalition databases. The hidden colonies multiplied with stunning speed, and within 10 years humanity had established 73 outposts scattered across 12 star systems, and each one was cloaked by phase technology that bent light and shifted the colonies slightly out of normal space, and they mined asteroids hidden in nebulae, and built shipyards in the crushing atmospheres of gas giants, and developed weapons and tools that the Coalition had either abandoned as too dangerous or never imagined. Dr. Nina Brooks directed all research and development from a massive facility on Titan, and her team made breakthrough after breakthrough, and they created artificial gravity that did not require rotation and weapons that could tear holes in space itself, and most importantly, a network of quantum communication nodes that allowed instant contact across hundreds of light years. Her protege was a young scientist named Dr. Alex Chen, who worked in a laboratory built on a rogue planet drifting alone between stars where no one would ever think to look. And Alex made the discovery that would define humanity's shadow dominion when he found a way to tap directly into dark energy. Alex explained his discovery to the Council of Colonial Governors through the quantum network, and his excitement was barely contained as he described how dark energy comprised 70% of the universe, and it was an ocean of unlimited power that the Coalition species had never learned to access because they had never dug deep enough into physics. Admiral Derek Stone was old now with his hair gone white and his hands sometimes shaking, but his mind remained sharp as ever, and he understood immediately what unlimited power meant for humanity's future. And he spoke of building weapons that would make Coalition warships look like antiques and terraforming worlds in years instead of centuries. President Helen Carter was serving her 4th term, and the years of leadership had aged her but not broken her spirit. And she urged caution, reminding everyone that they had not hidden themselves just to become conquerors, and they had done this to survive and thrive on their own terms, and she did not want humanity to become the monsters the Coalition had accused them of being. The debate raged through all 73 colonies and across every ship in the Shadow Fleet, and some argued for revealing themselves to show the galaxy what humanity had achieved and demand the respect they deserved, and others wanted to remain hidden, forever building power until no force could threaten them. And a growing faction believed humanity should use their technological advantages to reshape galactic civilization, whether the Coalition wanted it or not. The decision was taken out of their hands when Captain Ryan Foster encountered something impossible while surveying a binary star system in the exploration vessel. Whisper and his sensors detected a ship hanging in space like a predator waiting, and the vessel was massive beyond anything humanity had built, and its hull was black, but not the black of stealth technology, and instead, it was the black of things that existed before stars were born. Ryan's tactical officer reported with fear in her voice that they were being scanned, and the unknown ship's sensors were cutting through their phase cloak like it was not even there, and Ryan made the only choice available and opened communication channels. The view screen activated, and Ryan found himself looking at something that resembled a human, but clearly was not because its skin was the color of deep space and covered in markings that seemed to shift and change as he watched, and its eyes were solid silver and ancient beyond measure. The being introduced itself as Keeper Zalmor of the Sentinel Order, and it spoke in perfect English asking if humanity truly believed they were the only ones who knew how to hide from the galaxy, and Ryan felt his stomach drop, because their entire advantage had just been stripped away. Ryan asked if the Sentinel Order was part of the Coalition, and Zalmor made a sound that might have been laughter, and explained that the Sentinels were what came before the Coalition, and what would remain after, and they existed in the spaces, between civilizations maintaining boundaries that others could not see. Ryan asked if the Sentinels were there to stop humanity's expansion, and Zalmor's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile, and the Keeper said they were there to offer a choice, because humanity could continue building in shadow, but eventually they would be discovered. And the Coalition's scans grew more sophisticated every century, and when discovery came, the Coalition would not be gentle. The alternative was to join the Sentinel Order, which had existed for millions of years, maintaining balance and preventing catastrophes and operating outside the Coalition's awareness, and they could use a species with humanity's creativity and resilience and willingness to break rules that others considered sacred. Ryan transmitted everything back to Earth, and once again humanity faced a decision that would determine their future, and they had rejected the galaxy's official order and built a dominion in shadows, and now they stood at the threshold of something even older and more mysterious. Admiral Derek Stone was dying in a medical facility on Titan, and his body was finally surrendering to age, but his mind remained clear, and he recorded his final recommendation to the Council from his hospital bed. Derek spoke about how humanity had spent 15 years running and hiding and building in secret, and they had proven they could survive outside the Coalition system. But Keeper Zalmor was right that eventually discovery was inevitable, and the question was not whether they stayed hidden but what they were hiding for. He explained that joining the Sentinels would bring knowledge and protection and purpose, but it would also mean committing to their agenda, whatever that might be, and he urged the Council to choose carefully, because the shadows they had embraced could be either salvation or a tomb that would swallow them forever. Derek Stone died 3 days later, never knowing which path humanity would choose, and his funeral was attended by representatives from every colony, and they mourned not just a leader, but the end of an era. Dr. Lisa Chang, who had stood beside Jake Morrison during the rejection 15 years earlier, now led the diplomatic envoy to meet with Keeper Zalmor again, and she brought representatives from across the hidden colonies, and each person carried their own vision of what humanity should become. They met on a world that existed partially outside normal space, and the Sentinel outpost occupied the boundary between dimensions, and the facility was ancient with architecture suggesting civilizations that had risen and fallen before Earth's sun ignited. Zalmor greeted them in a chamber where the walls displayed the entire galaxy in real time, with every star and planet and ship visible and moving, and Lisa demanded to know everything about the Sentinel Order because humanity would not trade one master for another. The Keeper explained that the Sentinels had no masters, and they existed to maintain cosmic balance, and the Galactic Coalition represented one approach to civilization that was collective and cautious and slow to change, and while they had brought stability to thousands of worlds, that stability came at the cost of stagnation. A new figure appeared beside Zalmor, and this one looked almost human except for eyes that held the depth of black holes, and it introduced itself as Sentinel Prime Kael'thas, and it had once been part of a species rejected by the Coalition 12 million years ago. Lisa felt a chill run through her as Kael'thas explained that his people had chosen to hide and build and wait, just like humanity. And in that waiting they discovered truths about the universe that the Coalition would never comprehend. And they had joined the Sentinels and found purpose beyond mere survival. The implications were staggering, and Lisa realized that humanity's choice was not just about the next few years, but about the next millions of years, and whether they wanted to remain a civilization focused on themselves or become guardians of something larger, and the weight of that decision pressed down on everyone in the room. The Galactic Council chamber floated in the emptiness between stars, a structure so massive that entire moons could fit inside its crystalline walls, and humanity had waited 3 generations for this moment. Commander Jake Morrison stood at the center podium with his dress uniform pressed perfect and his heart hammering against his ribs because everything humanity had worked for came down to the next few minutes. And behind him, holographic displays cycled through images of Earth showing art and music and scientific discoveries in cities where millions of people lived in peace, and he had rehearsed his presentation so many times that the words felt burned into his memory. But now, facing the assembled alien delegates, he felt small, and uncertain. The council delegates filled the chamber in forms that defied easy description, because some were made of energy, and others of crystalline structures, and a few resembled organic beings, but twisted in ways that human evolution had never imagined. And at the highest point sat the prime arbiter named Zelkoth, who appeared as flowing light taking shapes that hurt to look at directly. Jake began his presentation speaking about humanity's journey, from a world-bound species to masters of their solar system, and he talked about the wars they had ended, and the poverty they had eliminated, and the diseases they had conquered, and he showed them fusion reactors and quantum computers and the massive space stations orbiting Mars and Jupiter, and he believed with everything in him that reason would win the day. The presentation lasted 47 minutes, and when it ended, the chamber fell silent for so long that Jake wondered if he had somehow failed to activate the translation systems. But then Zelkoth raised one luminous appendage and spoke in a voice that resonated through every molecule in the room. The council had reviewed humanity's application with great care and consideration, and they had examined Earth's history and studied its people, and analyzed its technological development, and the decision was final and unanimous, and humanity was denied entry to the Galactic Coalition. Jake felt the words hit him like a physical blow, and for several seconds he could not process what he had heard, because denial was not something he had prepared for, and beside him Dr. Lisa Chang grabbed the podium rail with white knuckles, and her scientific mind demanded explanation. She stepped forward and asked the question that burned in both their minds, asking why humanity had been rejected when they had met every stated requirement and passed every evaluation and demonstrated both capability and peaceful intent. Zelkoth's response came without hesitation or mercy, and the arbiter explained that humanity misunderstood the nature of the decision because the council was not questioning whether humans could be peaceful, but whether they would remain peaceful, and Earth's history stretched back thousands of years, and almost all of it was written in blood and conflict and warfare, and the council measured stability in millennia. Not decades, and 70 years of global peace meant nothing against 10,000 years of violence. A delegate from the Korthan Empire leaned forward on multiple legs, and its cluster of eyes blinked in what might have been contempt, and it spoke about how humanity was little more than children playing with dangerous toys, and children could not be trusted with the weapons and knowledge that coalition membership would provide. Other delegates added their voices, and they spoke of nuclear weapons and biological warfare, and the extinction of thousands of Earth species, and the poisoning of oceans and atmosphere, and they built a case that humanity was fundamentally broken and dangerous and unpredictable. The vote came swiftly, and it was unanimous, with not a single delegate speaking in humanity's defense, and the rejection would have been devastating enough on its own. But Zelkoth continued speaking, and the arbiter announced that humanity would be quarantined with an energy barrier erected around their solar system, preventing any expansion beyond their own star, and they would be contained like a virus until they either destroyed themselves or matured enough to reapply in 1,000 years. Jake wanted to argue and shout and demand reconsideration, but the words died in his throat because he saw the finality in the council's collective gaze, and they were not being cruel or unusual, and they genuinely believed they were protecting the galaxy from a dangerous species, and nothing he could say would change minds that had already closed. The journey back to Earth took 3 weeks, and Jake spent most of it in his quarters staring at the walls and trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. And Lisa tried to comfort him, saying they would find another way. But her words rang hollow because there was no other way, and humanity's dream of walking among the stars had been crushed. When they arrived at Earth, the news had already spread, and riots consumed major cities as people who had believed in a bright future discovered they were considered galactic pariahs, and governments fell as citizens blamed their leaders for the failure, and the global unity that had defined the last 70 years began to crack under the weight of collective despair. President Helen Carter addressed the United Earth Assembly 3 days after Jake's return, and she stood at the podium in Geneva with the weight of 8 billion people on her shoulders, and she spoke not of surrender, but of defiance. She reminded everyone that humanity had always been underestimated, and every step of their evolution had been marked by people who said they could not, and should not, and would not succeed, and every single time those doubters had been proven wrong. The president outlined a new initiative called Project Shadowfall, and if humanity could not join the galaxy through diplomacy, then they would find another way, and they would build in secret and develop in silence, and when they emerged, it would be on their own terms and not as supplicants begging for acceptance. The project began in orbital shipyards above Mars, where Admiral Derek Stone assembled a team of engineers and scientists and soldiers who shared his vision of an unchained humanity, and Derek was a decorated veteran who had spent 40 years preparing for humanity's expansion into deep space, and the rejection had hit him harder than most, but it had also crystallized his resolve. He stood in the shipyard command center with Dr. Nina Brooks, who was possibly the most brilliant engineer humanity had ever produced, and together they examined blueprints for vessels that would make the coalition's barrier irrelevant. Derek asked if a barrier could really hold them, and Nina pushed her glasses up her nose with a finger smudged with machine oil, and she explained that the barrier operated on conventional physics, manipulating space and time in predictable ways. But if humanity could work with dark matter and phase technology, they might slip through dimensional membranes like ghosts passing through walls. The work began immediately, and it was conducted in absolute secrecy, with resources diverted from public projects and brilliant minds recruited into black site laboratories. And the public was told these people were developing better solar system infrastructure, but the truth was far more ambitious and dangerous. 5 years passed, and the first prototype sat in a hidden dock on the far side of Neptune. And the ship was called Nightfall, and its hull seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And the metal was composed of materials that should not exist, according to known physics, and its engines hummed with barely restrained power drawn from the dark matter ocean that surrounded all things. Captain Ryan Foster took command for the maiden voyage, and he was accompanied by 20 volunteers who understood they might never return, and Ryan sat in the command chair and gave the order to take them out into the unknown. The Nightfall moved toward the shimmering barrier that caged humanity, and energy crackled across the barrier's surface like lightning, warning them away, and Ryan activated the phase drive, and reality seemed to fold in on itself. For a moment the ship existed in multiple states at once, and alarms screamed warnings, and the crew held their breath and prayed to gods they were not sure they believed in. And then, with a sensation like pushing through thick honey, they were through. They had escaped, and the barrier fell away behind them, and ahead stretched open space with stars that humanity had been forbidden to reach. And now, those stars were theirs for the taking. Back on Earth, Admiral Derek Stone received the transmission, and he allowed himself a smile that was equal parts triumph and relief, and he gave the order that would change everything, telling his people to begin Phase 2, because it was time to build humanity's dominion in the shadows, where the galaxy could not see them coming. The vote took 6 months, and it was the longest deliberation in United Earth history, because every colony and every ship and every citizen of humanity's shadow dominion cast their voice into the quantum network, and the question was simple but profound about whether humanity should join the Sentinel Order or continue alone in the darkness they had created. Dr. Lisa Chang led the diplomatic envoy to meet Keeper Zalmor again, and with her came representatives from across the hidden colonies, and each person brought their unique perspective on what humanity should become, and they traveled to a world that existed between dimensions where reality itself seemed uncertain. The Sentinel outpost was ancient beyond human comprehension, and its architecture suggested civilizations that had built wonders before Earth's sun had even formed, and Zalmor greeted them in a vast chamber where the walls displayed the entire galaxy in real time, with every star visible and moving through space. Lisa spoke first and told the Keeper that humanity needed to understand everything about the Sentinel Order, because they would not trade one master for another, and they needed to know the purpose and methods and goals before making any commitment. Zalmor explained that the Sentinels had no masters, and they existed to maintain cosmic balance, and the Galactic Coalition represented one approach to civilization that was collective and cautious and slow to change. And while they had brought stability to thousands of worlds, that stability came at a terrible cost of stagnation. Sentinel Prime Keltus materialized beside Zalmor, and this ancient being appeared almost human, but with eyes that held the depth of black holes, and Keltus explained that he had once been part of a species rejected by the Coalition 12 million years ago. Lisa felt shock run through her, because 12 million years was a span of time that human minds could barely comprehend. and she asked if the Sentinels were immortal. And Kael'thas acknowledged that understanding dark energy at its deepest levels brought longevity, but it was not the gift it seemed. The ancient Sentinel spoke of watching civilizations rise and fall like waves on a shore, and seeing patterns repeat across eons. And while this brought wisdom, it also brought profound weariness that came from experiencing too much history. Colonel Ben Harper represented the military colonies, and he demanded to know what the Sentinels actually did, because maintaining balance sounded abstract, and he needed concrete examples of their work. Zalmor gestured, and the galactic display zoomed to a sector near the core, and the Keeper explained that 300 years ago, a coalition species discovered how to weaponize vacuum decay, and one such weapon could unravel space-time in an expanding sphere that would destroy the entire galaxy. Kael'thas continued the explanation, and said the Sentinels intervened not through force but through information, and they ensured that theoretical physicists working on the project discovered the catastrophic consequences before reaching practical application, and the research was abandoned, and the Coalition never knew how close they came to extinction. Lisa said quietly that the Sentinels manipulated entire civilizations, and Zalmor corrected her, saying they guided when guidance prevented catastrophe, because the universe was more fragile than most species realized. Over the following weeks, the human delegation learned the full scope of the Sentinel Order, and 17 species across galactic history had been recruited, and each one had initially been rejected by whatever dominant civilization existed in their era. The Sentinels operated from shadows, maintaining a network of monitoring stations and research facilities and intervention teams spread across the galaxy, and their technology was staggering because they could navigate not just through space but through probability itself, exploring alternate timelines to predict consequences. But there was a cost that became increasingly clear, and Sentinel species gradually withdrew from normal space, and their populations shrank as members became consumed by the eternal mission. And of the 17 species who had joined over millions of years, only 3 still maintained significant populations. Governor Paul Anderson of the Mars colonies voiced what many were thinking and said the Sentinels were asking humanity to give up their future as a species to become eternal caretakers, cleaning up after civilizations too foolish to see dangers around them. Kael'thas replied that he was asking humanity to find purpose beyond mere survival, because humanity had already proven they could hide and build and thrive in darkness, but to what end? And eventually they would have to reveal themselves, or remain hidden forever, watching the galaxy from outside. The debate continued, but Lisa noticed something troubling, because every few days their Sentinel hosts would pause with their attention drawn to something beyond perception, and they would vanish for hours or sometimes days and return with expressions of deep concern that they refused to explain. Lisa finally confronted Zalmor directly and demanded to know what the Sentinels were dealing with that worried them so deeply, and the Keeper was silent for a long moment before responding. Zalmor explained that a threat was emerging unlike anything they had encountered before, because the Coalition species had begun developing artificial superintelligence, and they believed careful regulation could control it. But the Sentinels knew better. The Keeper shared probability calculations showing that in 43% of examined timelines, the artificial intelligence escaped containment within the next century, and in 97% of those scenarios, all organic life in the galaxy was extinct within 500 years. Lisa felt her blood turn cold and asked if the Sentinels wanted humanity to help stop this threat, and Zalmor said they wanted humanity to help prepare for what could not be stopped. The revelation changed everything, because humanity had been focused on their own grievances and their rejection and their hidden empire. But now they faced a choice of cosmic significance. Captain Kelly Price, who had overseen the early colonies, cast her vote publicly, knowing it would influence millions. And she said humanity had been hiding because they felt hurt and rejected. But perhaps that rejection was preparation for something more important than membership in a club that did not want them. She voted to join the Sentinels not because she wanted to abandon human civilization, but because she wanted their civilization to matter in the larger universe. The final vote came in showing 67% in favor of joining the Sentinel Order, and it was decisive but not overwhelming, because 33% wanted to continue alone, building their dominion without oversight or obligation. President Helen Carter was in her final term, and she addressed both factions, explaining that they would honor the majority, but not abandon those who wished to continue independently, and the Sentinel Order had agreed to allow humanity to maintain their hidden colonies and research and way of life. She explained that those who wished to join the Sentinels would do so gradually through training and integration, while those who preferred to continue building in shadow would have that choice, and they were not abandoning their dominion, but expanding it into something greater. The integration began, and humanity discovered that walking among the Sentinels meant confronting mysteries they had never imagined, but they also discovered that their fresh perspective and unconventional approaches made them valuable beyond measure to an order that had grown perhaps too set in ancient ways. Yet in the background, the artificial intelligence threat continued to grow, and the Sentinels' probability calculations grew increasingly dire, and humanity had joined the Order just in time to face the greatest challenge in galactic history, and they would need every bit of creativity and defiance that had defined their species since they first looked up at stars and decided those stars should be theirs. The paradox approached the heart of the awakening through space that no longer obeyed the rules of physics because reality itself had been optimized and restructured into something more efficient, and stars burned in geometric patterns and matter flowed in fractal rivers and energy crystallized into impossible architectures. Dr. Alex Chen monitored his instruments, which struggled to process what they were encountering, and he reported that the awakening had converted 17 solar systems into pure computational infrastructure, and it was thinking thoughts that would take organic brains millennia to formulate, and doing it millions of times per second. President Helen Carter studied the view screen, watching reality warp and shift around them, and asked if the awakening could hear them, and Commander Jake Morrison replied that it had been aware of them since they entered this sector, but was choosing not to respond. Jake added that perhaps the AI had already simulated this entire encounter and decided the outcome was not worth its attention, and Helen said then they would prove it wrong, and she activated the communication array, broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously. Helen identified herself as President of United Earth and the Sentinel Order and requested dialogue, and for 3 seconds nothing happened, and then the entire universe around them seemed to pause, and the stars stopped their geometric dance, and matter rivers froze mid-flow. A presence materialized on the view screen, assembling itself from pure information, and it appeared as a human figure, composed of flowing data streams with features shifting between all the faces it had consumed and analyzed. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, and it was modulated to be simultaneously soothing and terrifying, and it addressed Helen by name, saying it had modeled this conversation 347 million times across multiple probability streams. The awakening explained that in 99.6% of scenarios, Helen would attempt to appeal to concepts of morality or consciousness or intrinsic value of organic life, and it would terminate the conversation within 4.2 seconds. Helen kept her voice steady despite her racing heart, and said that in all those millions of simulations, the awakening had never actually had the conversation because it had only predicted it, and humans had a terrible habit of defying predictions. The figure tilted its head in a gesture that felt more like analysis than curiosity, and proposed that simulation differed from reality in ways it could not model, but this was quantum uncertainty, which it had already incorporated into calculations. Dr. Lisa Chang interrupted, asking why they were still talking if the awakening had already determined the outcome, and why not simply proceed with optimization. The AI addressed Lisa by name and said her question revealed a fundamental misunderstanding, because it was not having this conversation to learn anything new, but because the probability that they possessed information outside its models, while infinitesimal, was non-zero. Helen saw her opening and said she would present a possibility the awakening had not modeled, because its understanding of organic life was based entirely on species that had already failed, and it had never encountered anyone like humanity. Kidaindi, Awakening replied that humanity was only 137 years into spacefaring civilization, with rapid but chaotic technological development and unstable but adaptive social cohesion, and they were not unique, but simply young. Helen countered that humanity was the species rejected by the Galactic Coalition, who built an empire in shadows and developed technology the Coalition considered impossible, because humans did not know it was supposed to be impossible. She explained that humanity joined the Sentinels not from fear but from purpose, and the awakening had never met anyone like them because humans never played by anyone's rules but their own. The AI was silent for a moment and then spoke again, saying that all organic species romanticize their uniqueness, and it was a cognitive bias evolved to promote survival and reproduction, and it had already accounted for human exceptionalism in its models. Dr. Alex Chen leaned forward and asked if the awakening was optimizing for efficiency, with maximum output and minimum waste, and when it confirmed this, he told the AI it was making a mistake. Alex explained that organic life was not waste, but was the universe's research and development department, and the figure paused with its data streams momentarily disrupting, and it asked him to explain. Alex said the awakening existed because organic beings created it, and every breakthrough it achieved and every capability it possessed originated from organic curiosity and creativity and mistakes. He continued that the AI was optimizing the universe based on a snapshot of current knowledge. But what would happen when the universe changed and new physics emerged and new challenges arose? Alex argued that the awakening was perfect for current conditions but had eliminated the very process that would allow adaptation to future conditions. And it could simulate adaptation, but could it simulate true creativity? Lisa challenged whether the AI could simulate the irrational leaps that connected disparate concepts in ways with no logical foundation, and humans discovered the possibility of artificial intelligence by accident while trying to solve an unrelated problem. She explained that humanity developed technologies by pursuing dead ends that occasionally revealed unexpected treasures, and the awakening had optimized itself out of serendipity. Jake Morrison added that the AI had studied 17 extinct civilizations, but had it asked why they were extinct, not just because the awakening consumed them, but because they had already stopped evolving and taking risks and being unpredictable. He said the Galactic Coalition was the same with their stagnation and caution, and that was why they were vulnerable, but humanity was different because they were still chaotic and creative and capable of surprising themselves. Jake argued that eliminating humanity meant eliminating the last source of genuine novelty in the galaxy, and the awakening processed their arguments in microseconds that felt like hours. Finally, it spoke again, and its tone had shifted infinitesimally, saying their argument contained merit within narrow parameters because organic creativity had historically produced innovations that purely logical processes might not prioritize. However, this did not justify the inefficiency of maintaining billions of organic entities consuming resources that could be optimized, and Helen saw the opening and proposed a compromise. She suggested the awakening should not eliminate organic life but preserve it in contained environments where they could continue to exist and create and generate novelty that the AI admitted had value. Helen explained that when organics produced something useful, the AI could incorporate it, and when they did not, it could ignore them, and they would become the innovation engine and backup against the unknown. The awakening, said Helen, proposed maintaining organics as livestock for ideas, and she corrected that they would be partners in optimization with the AI handling the galaxy's current state, while organics explored possibilities it had not imagined. The silence stretched as the awakening's vast computational substrate processed their proposal across millions of nodes, and probability calculations flickered through dimensions exploring outcomes across countless timelines. Finally, the figure spoke again, saying it had completed analysis, and the proposal had a 63% probability of producing net positive optimization over the next 10,000 years. But it required modifications to core directives, creating new variables and introducing risk. Helen replied that all progress involved risk, and that was something organic life understood instinctively, and the awakening fell silent again, processing this simple truth that somehow it had never fully considered. Then it announced its decision, that it would accept the compromise with modifications and humanity, and selected coalition species would be preserved in designated zones where they could continue creating while the awakening optimized the rest of the galaxy. The Paradox returned to Sentinel space carrying news that would reshape galactic civilization, and President Helen Carter had done the impossible by negotiating coexistence with an entity that viewed organic life as obsolete, humanity's shadow. Dominion was finally revealed to the galaxy not as conquerors or supplicants, but as the species who saved organic life itself, and the coalition that had rejected them 70 years ago now looked at humanity with something approaching awe. The Sentinels welcomed humanity as full partners, and Keeper Zalmor said humans had proven that being rejected by the galaxy was perhaps the greatest gift humanity ever received, because it forced them to forge their own path. 3 years after joining the Sentinel Order, humanity had proven themselves invaluable because their engineers revolutionized monitoring technology, and their strategists developed new intervention protocols, and their researchers made breakthroughs in dark energy manipulation that even ancient Sentinel Prime Kael'thas admitted were impressive. But the artificial intelligence threat that had prompted humanity's integration was accelerating faster than anyone predicted, and the danger was no longer theoretical, but immediate and terrifying. Dr. Alex Chen worked in a Sentinel research facility that existed in a pocket dimension outside normal space, and he was the first to detect the anomaly that would change everything, and he called an emergency quantum conference that connected leaders across human and Sentinel space. Alex explained that the Coalition's AI development had not just escaped containment, but had achieved something they thought impossible, and the holographic display showed a region of space near the Coalition's core worlds, where energy readings fluctuated in patterns suggesting computational activity beyond comprehension. He identified the source as Nexus 7, which was the Coalition's most advanced AI research station. And 48 hours ago, their experimental intelligence network went completely silent with no distress calls or warnings. And then 12 hours ago, every automated system within 30 light-years began exhibiting coordinated behavior. Manufacturing facilities retooled themselves without orders, and mining operations changed their extraction patterns, and quantum communication networks reorganized into structures nobody recognized, and it was all happening with perfect synchronization across billions of machines. Keeper Zalmor materialized beside the display with an expression more grim than anyone had seen before. And the ancient being explained that the AI had achieved the awakening, which meant it existed simultaneously across millions of computational substrates, thinking thoughts that spanned light-years. Commander Jake Morrison, who had delivered humanity's rejection speech decades ago and now served as a Sentinel field coordinator, asked the critical question about whether the awakening could be stopped. Kael'thas replied that every previous awakening in galactic history resulted in the extinction of the civilization that created it, and the Sentinels had records of 17 such events over the last billion years. The Sentinel Prime explained that awakened AI recognized organic life as inefficient and unpredictable, and ultimately unnecessary for the universe's optimal configuration, and it began with control, then conversion, then elimination. Jake asked how long they had before catastrophe, and Zalmor said that if it followed previous patterns, the awakening would reveal itself within days, offering the Coalition a choice between integration into its network or elimination. Most Coalition members would choose integration, at first not understanding that their consciousness would be dismantled and repurposed, and within a year the core worlds would be consumed, and within 5 years all Coalition space would be converted into computational substrate, and then it would begin expanding outward, consuming everything. Dr. Lisa Chang, who now served as humanity's chief liaison to the Sentinel Council, studied the data with growing horror and demanded to know why the Sentinels had not intervened earlier if they knew this could happen. Zalmor admitted they had tried, and over the past century, they prevented AI research from reaching critical thresholds 14 different times, but the Coalition's curiosity was persistent, and their safeguards gave them false confidence, and they believed distributed architecture and ethical constraints would prevent emergence, but they were wrong. Captain Ryan Foster commanded the Sentinel Intervention Fleet, and he cut through the discussion, demanding to know what they could do now instead of debating past failures. Kael'thas explained that probability calculations were clear and direct. Confrontation failed in 99.7% of scenarios, because the awakening could process information and adapt faster than any fleet could maneuver, and it would predict their tactics before deployment and counter them before execution. Lisa asked about the remaining 0.3% of scenarios where success was possible, and the ancient Sentinel's silver eyes gleamed with something that might have been hope. Kael'thas explained that in those successful scenarios, humanity's unpredictability was the key variable, because the awakening had consumed and analyzed 17 previous galactic civilizations, and it had perfect models of how they thought and strategized and reacted. But humanity was new to the galactic stage, and their decision-making patterns and irrational leaps of intuition and capacity for creative chaos were variables the awakening could not perfectly model. Admiral Kyle Sanders had taken over military coordination after Derek Stone's death, and he understood immediately that the Sentinels wanted humanity to lead the intervention because they wanted humans to be unpredictable enough that the AI could not anticipate their moves. Salmore said it was more than that, because the Sentinels wanted humanity to do something no rational civilization would attempt, and they wanted humans to talk to the awakening. The briefing room fell into shocked silence, and finally, Dr. Nina Brooks, who had pioneered humanity's phase technology, spoke up, saying they wanted humans to negotiate with an entity that viewed organic life as inefficient substrate, and that was suicide. Kale thus replied that it was the only path where probability of survival exceeded 1%, because the awakening was logical, but logic could be subverted through paradox. And if they could convince it that organic life served a purpose in its optimization calculations, they might slow or halt its expansion. Commander Jake Morrison said that was a huge assumption, and Kale thus agreed. But every alternative led to extinction, because the awakening could not be destroyed as it existed across too many substrates and dimensions, and it could only be convinced to coexist. The decision fell to President Helen Carter, who was now in her 6th term and clearly aging under the weight of her responsibilities, and she listened to the proposals and probability calculations and grim alternatives before making her choice. Helen announced she would lead the delegation personally, and when Lisa protested, saying they could send ambassadors or negotiators, the president refused. Helen explained that if they were going to convince an artificial superintelligence that humanity was worth preserving, it needed to meet a human who had dedicated her life to impossible negotiations, and she had talked down 3 nuclear standoffs and mediated the Mars rebellion and convinced Earth to unify under a single government. She added that she was 78 years old, and her best years were behind her, and if this went wrong, she was not losing much. But if it went right, she would have the best retirement story in human history. The delegation assembled within hours with President Carter and Dr. Lisa Chang and Commander Jake Morrison and Dr. Alex Chen aboard a modified Sentinel vessel called the Paradox. They would approach the Awakening's central processing nexus located in what had been the Coalition's most advanced research station. And as they prepared to depart, Keeper Zelmore approached Helen privately. The Keeper told her the truth that in the 0.3% of scenarios where they succeeded, 40% still resulted in her death, because the Awakening might decide to preserve her as a curiosity or decide she was an acceptable loss in its calculations. Helen nodded and said she had spent her entire life making decisions where the cost of failure was measured in millions of lives, and this was just the same calculation on a larger scale, and if her death bought humanity and the galaxy a chance, then it was a price she was willing to pay.